Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Alexandra Gheciu. I am one of the coordinators of the Security Studies Network, as well as the Associate Director of SIPS. And on behalf of Mark Salter, Michael Williams, and myself, it is my very special pleasure to welcome all of you to today's event on America Abroad by our colleague, Professor William Wohlforth of Dartmouth College. Now, it is a universally acknowledged truth that those of us who work in the field of international relations agree on very few things. One of those very few things on which we do agree, however, is the idea that since the end of the Second World War, the world has been profoundly shaped by American power and by Washington's decision to be deeply engaged in the world. Today, however, many analysts argue that in the 21st century, the US will be increasingly unable and perhaps unwilling to exercise the kind of global role that so many of us have come to take for granted for so long. And yet, there is another quite influential school of thought that argues that we should not assume that unipolarity will go away anytime soon, and that the ever-growing call for the US to pursue a policy of retrenchment is indeed misguided. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us one of the most influential voices in this school of thought that argues that unipolarity need not necessarily go away. And as our guest put it in a recent article published in International Security, America should not come home, at least not anytime soon. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you our guest, Bill Wohlforth. As I said, he is the Daniel Webster Professor of Government at the Dartmouth College in the US. He is the author or editor of 7 books and some 60 articles and chapters on topics that range from the Cold War and its end to unipolarity and American grand strategy in the 21st century. Among his recent books, let me just mention his latest, which is Status and World Order, published by Cambridge University Press this year. This was co-edited with T.V. Paul and Deborah Larson. And I know that Bill is already working on a new book manuscript that shares the title of today's talk on America Abroad. Now, in addition to his very impressive academic achievements, Bill Wohlforth is also someone who has successfully transcended that boundary between academia and the world of practice. He is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and has served as consultant for the National Intelligence Council and the National Bureau of Asian Research. And last but not least, between 2008 and 2011, he was editor-in-chief of the US-based journal Security Studies. It was my privilege to work with Bill at Security Studies. I learned a lot from him in that context, and I am sure I will continue to learn from him today and in the future. So without further ado, can I just ask all of you to please join me in welcoming our guest to the floor. Thank you, Bill, for being here.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Allow me to turn this on. Thank you for that fabulous introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me here, Alexandra. It was indeed one of the many pleasures of, among all of the challenges, one of the outstanding pleasures of working at the journal Security Studies was getting to work with Alexandra, whose fine scholarly judgment and fundamental to the core niceness helped in a job that isn't always rewarding nice behavior. And it's also to her, I think, that I owe the most thanks for this invitation to come here. It's really my great pleasure to be here, to meet you all, to talk to you today, and also to visit Ottawa, this is my first visit to the capital of our friendly neighbor to the north. I have obviously spent lots of time in Canada, many long and enjoyable parts of my life, but never in the capital, and it's a beautiful city. You're very lucky to be here. So without further ado, I'll get to my 35 minutes or so of remarks to you. I want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers, because of course, when you're dealing with the subject of America's role in the world, it's pretty uncontroversial, so you're probably not going to have much to really ask about. But indeed, Alexandra set the talk up exactly where it is, which is the question of whether these two constants, America's position in the international system as a preeminent power and America's strategic choice to be deeply engaged in the world, what are these two constants are long going to stay with us? And there are, I think, more than ever, reasons to question these two constants that have been in place since 1945. The rise of China being clearly the most important. By one calculation, the Chinese economy, at least at purchasing power parity way of measuring it, is now larger than the United States economy. And it's not only that, it's a general sense in Washington and I think around the world of frustration and failure, that America's policies just aren't working out very well. And that sense of failure, inability to achieve stated objectives, against the backdrop of what seems to be a decline in overall capabilities, leads many to argue that the era of American preeminence, the American century, is ending. And in addition, I think it's fair to say that pressure is building on America's deeply engaged grand strategy. It's building both from that same sense of frustration and setbacks that we see around the world. It's building because of fiscal and budgetary pressures in the United States. It's building such that you see long-standing stalwart bulwarks of American engagement, like the Republican Party in the House of Representatives, supporting a budget deal called sequestration that involved a massive, unplanned, non-strategic cut to the United States Department of Defense budget. That was a very important kind of canary in the coal mine for financing this grand strategy. Last, and perhaps many might think least, in academia, the strategy of deep engagement is in deep trouble, with arguably, at least in the world that I know, in the American U.S. scene, the dominant position among scholars of international security is that we should cut, the United States should cut its ties to many, if not all, of its key alliance partners and basically come home. That is the dominant position, I would argue, among security studies scholars based in the United States. So both of these constants, I think, are as never before in doubt. And the book that I'm writing with my good friend, close collaborator, Steve Brooks, also from Dartmouth, addresses these two questions. And those of you who are familiar with our previous work may not be surprised to our answer to these two questions is no. Those two constants are in fact going to remain in place. And let me, for the remainder of my remarks, just talk in sequence about each of these two big pieces. The first big piece is America's role in the world, and the second big piece is the strategic choice. Let me just walk you through some of the headline findings and arguments from our book, and then we'll break it out into question and answer. So to begin with the sort of the big picture of the U.S. role in the world, I think there's a couple of parts to this. The first part is the boring part. The first part is concepts. The first part is language. The first part is the terms we use to discuss change in world politics. In particular, how we think about change in a world that has one leading state that's widely acknowledged still to be the leading state. Concepts matter. As J.S. Mill noted in System of Logic, every proposition consists of two names, or two concepts, and every proposition affirms one and denies the other. So the way we talk about international policy today is usually to take a concept. Most popular one, I'm afraid to say for better or for worse, is unipolarity. And we say the world is or is not unipolarity. That is to say, the standard argument is going to be unipolarity is ending, is about to end, and it's going to be replaced by some other name. Apolarity, non-polarity, multipolarity, bipolarity, you name it. We argue in this book, notwithstanding the fact that we both have made substantial intellectual commitments to the concept of unipolarity, we argue that we should think about contemporary dynamics differently, using a different terminology. We see a number of problems with the whole polarity concept as it's used in this debate. One is just simple confusion. In the book, we identify 9 completely distinct definitions of the term unipolarity, according to which unipolarity either has never existed in the history of mankind, once existed for a brief period but doesn't exist anymore, still exists but is about to end, or is likely to exist for decades to come. All the same term, essentially generating a conversation of people talking past each other. That's one problem, but there's another bigger problem, I think, and that is a kind of all or nothing bias built into the polarity concept. The whole idea leads to a dichotomous way of thinking. Something either is unipolarity or it's not. And that feeds a kind of artificial debate about whether everything is changing or nothing is changing. It's clear to all but the blind that something has changed since the mid-1990s when we first introduced the idea of unipolarity, mainly due to the rise of Chinese power. But is the system now bipolar? Most would probably say no. Is it truly multipolar as it was in the 19th century? Most scholars, at least, are doubtful about that. But is everything the same as it was in 1995? The answer is also clearly no. It follows that any conceptual framework for addressing change in a system dominated by one state should not force us into this dichotomous choice of either is or isn't. So we propose another way of thinking about the contemporary system that we base on the work of the distinguished Canadian-British scholar of international politics, Barry Buzan. I don't know how many of you who know IR know that Barry grew up in this country to escape the fog and smog of London. He was a kid during the famous dangerous smogs that London had in the 1950s, so his family brought him to nice, clean Canada. And that's a fortunate thing, because it was Barry who later would go on to develop this idea of a 1 plus X world. And it's that 1 plus X world that is, I think, and we think, a more fruitful way to think about this debate. That is to say, we have one superpower, which is clearly in a class by itself in terms of overall resources, and it's the only state capable of organizing major political military action pretty much anywhere in the system. Few doubt this. And then we have X major powers. Some number X, and we can debate who should be in the X club. Is Brazil in it, India, should we add Indonesia? But it's some club of major powers, clearly more significant than the rest, but whose fundamental activity and influence is regional rather than global still. And then we have one state, which is not just any old X power. That's China. That's clearly in a class by itself, seemingly greater than the other X powers, but not yet a peer of the United States as a superpower. And what we lack is a terminology for describing where China is or is likely to be. Hence, we're stuck in this everything is changing or nothing is changing kind of stalemate. So we want to think about a way of thinking about the path that China might or might not follow between being sort of a little bit more than an X power to being a true superpower peer of the United States. It could be a level above a great power in the sense that it's transitioning from a simple major power to a potential superpower. Or the next level above that, it could be a potential superpower that does, in fact, unambiguously have the latent capacity to match the superpower if it were to try, which you might call a latent superpower. And the next level above that is a state that is, in fact, transitioning to become a superpower, kind of actualizing superpower. So that's a terminology we're going to use to try to get away from the stuck nature that we argue the debate now is characterized by. That's basically the first part of the first section of the talk, the conceptual part. So all the boring stuff's over. Now we get to the second piece of the first part of the where US is in the system, which is essentially measuring this thing. Doing the hard work of figuring out, well, having set up this whole conceptual framework, where is China and where is the United States and how does it all shake out? And of course, you're now getting worried that I'm going to now flash a whole bunch of tables and figures and numbers at you, but I'm not. I'm just going to summarize the sort of bottom line of what in the book is a comprehensive synoptic assessment of all kinds of dimensions of capability, from technology to economics to military to demographic, everything you can name. And ultimately, I will just give you our bottom line, which we can return to in the Q&A if you like. And that is that China is very likely to remain stuck in this second stage that we discussed, the stage where a state is transitioning from being a major power to a potential superpower for much longer than almost everyone in the current debate thinks. It's likely to remain in that midpoint stage between being a member of the X Club and a peer for a very, very long time, and primarily for two reasons. The first is that compared to all past rising states that have risen up against a dominant state, China is comparatively at a low level of technological development. Its technological level is relatively low compared to the leading state when one compares it to past rising powers. And the second piece is that the barrier to entry, to becoming a first-class military power, the barriers are far higher now than in the previous eras because modern weapons are so extraordinarily complex both to make, to organize, and to use effectively. Thus, we argue that whereas one might think that once China's economy is the same size as the US, and we can debate when that is, now it's in terms of purchasing parity, in terms of market exchange rate, it won't be for a while. You might think that when China is the same economic size, then it's just a matter of choice for China to decide to become a superpower. But our argument is that even if that choice is made, and there's no evidence that it's been made, but even if that choice is made, the barriers between making the choice and realizing that choice in terms of creating the globe-girdling capacity that a superpower needs, that gap is much larger now than it was in previous cases of international political change that we're familiar with. Another way of putting this is not your great-grandfather's power transition. This is not a mid-20th power transition. This is not like China, Germany, Soviet Union in the mid-20th century. This is not like Germany at the end of the 19th century, because the barriers to entry are much higher today. You can't simply just immediately translate economic capacity into superpower capacity the way you used to be able to in a matter of 5, 6, 7 years of concentrated effort. That's not even including the issue of demographics, which I haven't spoke of. The way to summarize a demographic issue for contemporary China is to say that every past power transition was between states that were demographically young. All of them were young in the old days. Why? Because nobody was old in the old days. Basically, we had life expectancies in the 50s and 60s. But today is the first time ever we're having a power transition where the rising state is going to get demographically old before the declining state. In other words, the declining US will be demographically younger than the rising, challenging China. And that is absolutely unprecedented in the history of power transitions and has profound consequences that we talk about. But let me just get to the bottom line. The bottom line here is that the system is indeed changing. China is rising. China is not just a regular old member of the X Club. There's no question that the US alliance system, the West, broadly speaking, has declined. The biggest movement in that decline is the economic decline of the EU and Japan. The US is a little less evident. There's no question that there are these changes. But the US has not declined and will not soon decline to the point where it cannot sustain a global strategy of deep engagement if it wants to. The US retains its ability to choose how engaged it wants to be globally. And for a very long time, the US is the only country in the world that has this choice. No other country can choose a strategy like an American grand strategy. And that brings us to the second part of the talk, which is, should the United States choose to continue this strategy or not? And that, of course, is debate we've been involved in, together with Steve Brooks and John Eikenberry, wrote a couple articles about this in Foreign Affairs and in International Security. I don't obviously think anybody's necessarily read those articles, but if you're interested in more, it's out there. Of course, the book goes into much greater depth. What I want to do in the next 10 minutes or so is, 10, 15 minutes maximum, I promise, is to make the case about what the U.S. should do in the current circumstances regarding its grand strategy, and that case is not as simple as it might sound. What we argue for, in effect, is that what the U.S. should do is refocus on what we call the core of its deep engagement strategy. And the real choice, we think, is between refocusing on the core or retrenching. That's the real debate. And that's not the debate you necessarily hear in Washington, but I'm going to argue to you that it is, in fact, the debate that is underlying and should be informing the debate in Washington. I know that's a little bit convoluted, but it'll be clear in a second, I hope. So to do what I want to do, I got to tell you what the core is, What do we mean by the core of the grand strategy? Then I have to tell you what I think the real choice is. And then finally, I have to tell you why I think the choice should be to refocus on the core. So let me walk you through those things really quickly. First, the core of American grand strategy. Grand strategy is a much bandied about term, but it really does have a meaning. It's a set of ideas for deploying a nation's resources to achieve its interests over the long run. We use the word grand to capture the large-scale nature of this enterprise in terms of time, namely it's a long-term focus, stakes, the interests are the biggest and most important stakes, and comprehensiveness. Grand strategy deals with a blueprint or a guiding logic for policies across many areas. Now with this in mind, what is the core, the essence of U.S. grand strategy really since 1946, 47, 48, whenever you want to date it? Is it democracy promotion? Is it human rights promotion? Is it transforming other societies to be just like the United States? Critics of the current grand strategy often say that those are the defining elements. Are they right? No, they're not right. None passes the time tests of grand strategy. None of those aims of transformation, democratization, human rights promotion capture the long-term commitments. They varied from administration to administration, even within a single presidency. None captures the largest and most enduring interests the U.S. have pursued. They've repeatedly been seen as options that they can be pursued as long as the core interests are secure. None provides a blueprint that guides America's actions across multiple regions on issues. No, what lies at the core of U.S. grand strategy is the pursuit of three fundamental, long-standing objectives. First is managing the external environment to reduce threats to U.S. national security, near and long term. Second, consistent feature is promoting a liberal economic order to expand the global economy and maximize U.S. prosperity. And third is creating, sustaining a global institutional order to secure necessary interstate cooperation. Those three objectives have been constants of grand strategy for the past 65 years. They've consistently trumped the other aims whenever the two have come into conflict. And it is the pursuit of those three, this is getting to the essence here, folks, it's the pursuit of those three objectives that lie at the center of the fundamental choice the U.S. made to maintain security partnerships with key allies and partners in the core regions of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Those partnerships are all about the securing of those three objectives of security, economic prosperity, and institutionalized cooperation. At the core of the strategy are those commitments. Okay, so now that I've told you what the core is, I want to just take a second to say what we think the choice is. Back during the Cold War, the core was at the center of grand strategy, obviously, as the U.S. in Washington worked really, really hard to sustain these basic commitments, to make them credible, in order to pursue the three objectives that I laid out for you. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, we entered a 20-year period in which we essentially took the core for granted. The core that I just described to you was sort of like oxygen. It was in the air and you breathe it, but who cares? Who's really talking about it? And we began to entertain other, perhaps grander, perhaps nobler objectives, or maybe not so noble. We pursued enlargement of the democratic community under Bill Clinton and National Security Advisor Tony Lake. Under George W. Bush, we pursued a democratization agenda. We wanted to transform the Middle East. We wanted to solve the fundamental problems. We wanted to get beyond the superficial approaches that we'd done in the past, and that got us into a couple of wars. We wanted to deal with the terrorism problem in a fundamental war with the global war on a fundamental way with a global war on terror. But now, as I've said in the introduction to this talk, I don't think you can take the core for granted anymore. I think the rise of China, the newly assertive stances of several key powers, but especially Russia, the budget constraints, the changing political environment in Washington, all of the issues I've discussed mean that now the core is on the table. Now the core is on the chopping block. And we need to make a choice. We need to make a choice between that core and really between retrenching back from the core. I think the grandiose visions are off the table and should be off the table for the foreseeable future. So that's the choice between maintaining the core or moving towards a retrenchment. Cutting back all or most of our multifarious security, I'm sorry for using our, I'm speaking as a citizen of the United States, a cutback in all of the United States multifarious, most or all of its security commitments to allies and partners. Come back home and get back engaged deeply in the security affairs of the rest of the world only if some overpowering geopolitical threat compels that. And the case for retrenchment is very serious. They argue, the critics of the current grand strategy, increasingly salient and increasingly strident, argue that it's unsustainably costly. We can't foot the bill. Even if it can be sustained, it's hurting our long-term economic growth and competitiveness. It's deeply unfair because we subsidize our truculent, feckless, free-riding allies. We infantilize them, to use Barry Posen's term, making them dependent upon Uncle Sugar, as the retrenchment people like to call the U.S., Uncle Sam, and then they don't have realistic security strategies because they don't have to. Moreover, the argument goes that the current strategy will cause other states to get mad at us and balance against us. It will cause us to be entrapped by our allies' security concerns, dragging us into wars that are not in the United States' interest. It tempts us to intervene all over the world with the old, if all you have is a big hammer, every problem looks like a nail argument. If you've got this big military, you're going to think it's the solution to everything. And not, at the end of the day, that the world can take care of itself without us. They don't need us anymore. They've grown up. The tutelage of American security provision is no longer needed. So that's, I think, a very serious, intellectually strong case against the current grand strategy. Let me take 10 minutes here to show you why it's wrong, and then we'll conclude. I think it's wrong, and I think that we should sustain the grand strategy through refocusing on the core. And I want to stress that many of the arguments, just to presage what I'm about to say, many of the arguments against the grand strategy are actually not really against the core as I've described it. They're against the optional efforts to pursue more grandiose visions. Those efforts arising from dissatisfaction with the core, dissatisfaction with the basic precepts of U.S. grand strategy. People have wanted to do more. And so that dissatisfaction with the core comes as much from the right wing or neoconservative wing of the American perspective, as the dissatisfaction comes from the more realist, critical wing to the core. In other words, the core of the strategy is getting hit from both sides. And I want to argue to you now why it's a mistake to undermine those basic precepts. The first quick point here to make is I think that the criticisms are overstated. And they're not wrong, with one exception, but they're overstated. They're overstated. The exception is this argument of balancing, that somehow by pursuing an engaged strategy, the U.S. will prompt other states to ramp up their military capacity faster than they would if the United States did not engage. In other words, to protect themselves against the U.S., other states will devote more to their militaries. We see very, very little evidence. We don't offer balancing of this type. Indeed, the balance of what we know suggests the contrary, that if the U.S. were to withdraw and the key regions would have to secure themselves, that their military efforts would in fact increase rather than decrease. The rest of the arguments are just overstated. Yes, the costs are high. And yes, in a tighter budget environment, we'll have to pay attention to these costs. But it's completely wrong to say that the costs are unsustainable. The post-9/11 global war on terror ramp-up brought defense spending upwards of 5% of GDP. But it's already winding down, and even if we got rid of the sequester and started funding the defense budget at the levels that the defense leadership would like, we're still going to be around 3.5% of GDP. There's simply no evidence that defense spending at that level is unsustainable or damaging to long-term economic prospects. Unfairness free riding, people who here are citizens of Canada, which is obviously a U.S. ally, will be, I'm sure, curious to hear. What's our answer to free riding? That if we keep providing the security, the allies will underprovide it. I think it's understated a bit. It under-recognizes divisions of labor between the United States and its allies. It is unfair to the allies in some ways, not least Canada, and not least on a day like today, where if you look at casualties as a proportion of population, some of our allies, including Canada, have put more into some operations than the United States itself has. In other words, the costs of Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi freedom, measured as a proportion of population, have been, in terms of blood, higher for some of our allies than the United States itself. But more importantly, I think the free riding issue is essentially an issue about emotion. It's about fairness. If you listen to the talk of these realists who argue against restraint, you hear an emotional tone in their voice. And Steve Brooks and I say, you know what, grand strategy is not a place for a lot of emotions. Deal with it. Yeah, they're going to spend a little less. That's one of the costs of the strategy. Does it hurt the U.S.? No. It just means they don't spend as much as we would like. Live with it. It's not the end of the world. I'm not outraged that Germany is not spending as much as I wish it would spend. I just, that's part of the hard-edged strategic reality we have to deal with. The temptation argument is very serious. That if all I have is a hammer argument, that the strategy is just going to get us into trouble, is a very serious argument, and one that bears careful attention. But empirically, it really boils down to Afghanistan and Iraq. Those two wars accounting for over 90% of the blood and treasure costs the United States has borne in all the wars it's fought, including since the end of the Cold War, including the Gulf War, the first Iraq War. 90% of all the costs, of all the interventions the United States has done since 1990 are those two wars. Now, of course, that's sort of like, other than, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln, other than the unfortunate event. Those are two big exceptions. The question is whether the strategy of deep engagement is sustainable without future large counterinsurgency operations. And I think there's every reason to believe that it is. And here I would simply make an analogy to Vietnam. We had a very, very bad experience in Vietnam. It was much, much, much more costly than Iraq and Afghanistan. But when it was over, the U.S. said, you know what? I think we can continue to do the core of the grand strategy without any more things like Vietnam. And for the rest of the entire Cold War, the U.S. got out of the counterinsurgency business and decided that somehow it learned that that wasn't central to the mission. And I think that lesson is now very deeply embedded in Washington and unlikely to be repeated. So that's the first major argument, that their argument, the retrenchment people, the people who want us to retrench or follow the grand strategy they call restraint, are overstating, exaggerating the arguments they make against the current grand strategy. But that's not the main argument. I'm just going to end on this as the last substantive part of the talk. And that is, they underestimate the benefits of the strategy. And the critics who underestimate the benefits of the strategy include, as I've said, not just these realist critics who favor retrenchment, but also the neoconservatives and others in Washington who are dissatisfied with the strategy and want to do more. And they understate the benefits for a very simple human psychological reason. That the power to prevent things from happening is harder to observe, and therefore more taken for granted, than the power to make things happen. The fundamental critique of American foreign policy, the reason you probably think, and most people think, it's in crisis and it's failing, is because of demonstrable failure to achieve positive objectives. What people are not looking at are the bad things that could or even would happen if the U.S. changed its grand strategy. The U.S., although it has occasionally entertained pipe dreams about remaking the entire world, is at the end of the day a status quo power. It basically likes the world order as it exists. And for a status quo power, the key thing that it is seeking in its grand strategy is blocking power, preventing power. Power to prevent worse worlds from emerging from the one that exists. And so what we do in the book is we ask the huge counterfactual question, which is, what would the world be like if, in fact, the U.S. decided fully and unambiguously to retrench? Now, that, of course, is a counterfactual question. It's very hard to answer. The only way to answer is to dig deep, deep, deep into scholarly work, models and theories and empirical work to try to do the best job we can to estimate what this world would be like. As far as I'm aware, no other scholars have undertaken so comprehensive an effort to do this. And I think on balance, most of what we know in international relations would suggest that a decision to retrench would make the world probably a worse place, but it would certainly be worse for the United States. And let me just quickly walk through what might happen if the U.S. fully and unambiguously followed the advice of people like Barry Posen and unambiguously retrenched. I think you'd see a general decrease in overall global security. Increased tensions, increased arms races, increased security dilemmas. Why? Because the U.S. is providing security to about 70 countries. And so it's just a simple question. If the U.S. is providing security to 70 countries and it removes that security, the world will therefore be less secure. And those countries will start doing things to defend themselves that will generate potential problems in their neighborhoods. I'm not saying the world is perfect now. I'm saying it'll be a lot less perfect if the security guarantees are withdrawn. This is most clear in Asia, where I think Japan and South Korea would almost certainly expand their military capabilities if the U.S. were to leave, which could provoke potentially dangerous reaction from China. I think that the problems in the Middle East, as great as they are, would probably be even greater if certain U.S. partners were unhinged from U.S. security. If Turkey, if Israel, if Egypt, if Saudi and the Gulf states suddenly had no United States to rely on, would it get better? I have a feeling actually it wouldn't get better. And NATO. Would European security improve without Article 5? Would it improve? Would the Europeans really get their act together and finally create this awesome security institution without Article 5? I have profound doubts on that score, leaving Europe vulnerable to all sorts of potential predation by outside powers. In addition, I think you'd see nuclear proliferation cascades. A U.S. withdrawal would probably spark these newly insecure states to seek nuclear weapons. Not all of them, but many of them. Egypt, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, possibly Saudi Arabia. Many of these states actually have tried to build nuclear forces in the past. Many have programs that can be switched on relatively quickly. Unless you think lots of nuclear proliferation is a good idea, you're going to be concerned about the proliferation impact of U.S. withdrawal. I think in addition, for the U.S. perspective, the restraint or the retrenchment strategy would reduce in much less leverage for the United States to try to get cooperation on things that it's interested in. That is to say, provision of security. Yes, it doesn't make allies into sort of always compliant partners on every issue. Yes, they still pursue their own interests. Yes, allies refuse to do some things the United States asks. But on balance, pulling out the security guarantee will vitiate U.S. leverage, make it harder to build coalitions when the United States wants. I think that the restraint, the U.S. in providing security also seeks to restrain allies. It also seeks to use leverage to get what it wants in terms of cooperation. All those tools, all of that leverage would go down. And finally, let me just say that a retrenched world would probably be one in which there were fewer economic benefits for the United States and perhaps even a lower overall global economic welfare. Deep engagement brings a series of potential goods from the standpoint of the global economy. One is that it reduces, if we are correct in our argument, it reduces the overall level of conflict. And in general, in a globalized world, conflict, arms races, security dilemmas are bad for prosperity and commerce. U.S. military commitments are helpful for ensuring the openness of the sea lanes and other shipping corridors. It's helpful in terms of leverage that the U.S. likes to use when it tries to negotiate globalization agreements of various kinds. And finally, the deep engagement strategy also enables the United States to have more influence than it otherwise would when it comes to fostering institutionalized cooperation on issues that matter. It's not to say the United States dictates outcomes. That's not to say that the United States is sometimes excluded or fails to achieve what it wants. But at the end of the day, its ability to foster partnerships with other countries, to provide incentives with other countries to join multilateral endeavors is much, much higher than it would be without the deep engagement strategy. There's a lot, as Alexandra said earlier at the beginning, what now seems like a very long time ago to you, I'm sure. She said that there's not a lot of stuff that IR scholars really agree on, but if you read carefully the literature on institutions, they actually agree that whereas having a leading state that's engaged and active is not necessary to achieve cooperation, it almost always is going to make cooperation more likely. So pull the engaged U.S. out of the equation, the overall prospects for cooperation go down. And since many issues that the U.S. cares about are ones that can only be addressed through such cooperation, that's a substantial cost the U.S. would bear if it undertook the advice of our opponents in this debate and retrenched. So let me conclude this remark. The two constants that have shaped world politics since the early Cold War of a very, very powerful United States and a globally engaged United States can stay with us. They are modified from what they were in the 1990s, but they are still in place. They still allow a U.S. decision to remain engaged. They still give the United States the material wherewithal to avoid conducting the massive social science experiment that retrenchment would entail. Let's see how the world works without us. We argue that we'd rather not run that experiment if we don't have to. Our findings suggest that we don't have to. We therefore think we should remain engaged, but we should focus on the core. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks.
Well,